Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we follow Miss Marple into the secret written in frost on the window. A quiet room, a frozen pane, and a message no one admits to writing. Tell me, are you listening in the stillness of night? Now, pour something warm and let the mystery begin. The Sunday quiet of St. Mary Mead drifted like a soft shawl across the village, settling over garden walls, the lane by the churchyard, and the front windows still silvered with the last trace of morning frost. Inside the parish hall, warmth and chatter mingled as the Winter Comforts Committee gathered for their customary post-service tea, a ritual so dependable it felt as though the village itself inhaled and exhaled with it. Cups clinked lightly, chairs scraped on polished boards, and Mrs. Weatherby's plum cake made its usual ceremonial appearance. Yet, before the assembled ladies could sink fully into the comfortable rhythm of their weekly gossip, something like a passing shadow slid across the atmosphere, subtle as a curtain stirring before a door opened. It began with Mrs. Hartwell's offhand comment as she placed her gloves upon the table. "Strangest thing, truly," she murmured, smoothing the wool with a distracted air. "The frost on my breakfast-room window this morning. It appeared to have a shape to it, as though someone had drawn upon the glass." Her tone was mild, but the sentence landed with the delicate weight of a teacup touching its saucer, small, yet undeniably present. Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on detecting impropriety before it fully formed, leaned forward, eyes sharp with a mixture of curiosity and social vigilance. "Children?" she suggested, though the notion clearly displeased her. "There have been reports, faint but persistent, of certain youngsters wandering about at odd hours." "That may be," Mrs. Hartwell conceded, "but the pattern seemed too deliberate, almost written." She lifted her spoon without quite noticing she held it, as though contemplating how one might trace a line across cold glass. Miss Marple, seated slightly apart in her usual unobtrusive spot near the hearth, observed the gentle swell of speculation with the faintest lift of her eyebrows. At 80, she understood better than most that distress rarely enters a room with a flourish. It comes instead as a whisper, a small detail dismissed at first, returning only when its significance has sharpened, but she said nothing. She simply folded her hands, listening not to the words themselves but to the hesitations between them. Soon talk drifted toward the upcoming charity raffle, yet the earlier remark lingered like a mild draught no one could quite locate. Mrs. Weatherby fussed with the tea urn more than necessary, and even the vicar's cheerful inquiry about the flower rota failed to restore the equilibrium entirely. Something had shifted the faint hush that precedes a confession, perhaps, and though it barely troubled the surface, Miss Marple sensed its gentle pull beneath. When the meeting adjourned, ladies gathered their scarves and stepped into the brittle afternoon air. Frost clung stubbornly to shaded corners of the sun, low but bright, scattered pale rays that hesitated upon eaves and hedges. Miss Marple walked a short distance beside Mrs. Hartwell, whose brisk manner seemed unusually muted. "It must have been the cold," Mrs. Hartwell said suddenly, as though correcting an error she feared she had made. "You know how frost can play tricks. I dare say it meant nothing." Miss Marple offered a soft, reassuring smile. "Nature does enjoy embroidery, my dear, and our imaginations are sometimes its willing apprentices." But behind the words lay her own quietly forming question. Why did Mrs. Hartwell seem less convinced than she wished to appear? And why had her voice tightened, just for a second, at the description of the window? Miss Marple tucked the thought away, as she often did carefully, without judgment, like a mending needle slid into its cloth. Across the lane, two villagers paused to greet them. Mr. Larkin, the postmaster, exchanged pleasantries about the unpredictable cold snap. Beside him stood his wife, slightly flustered, brushing flour from her sleeves, evidence of a half-finished tart. Their cheer was genuine, yet neither could resist casting a quick glance toward the vicarage, where a constable's cap glinted through the gate. "Nothing serious, I'm sure," Mr. Larkin said at once, before anyone had asked. It was the unnecessary nature of the reassurance that gave it weight. Miss Marple let her gaze travel discreetly to the path leading toward the vicarage porch. The constable's stance was formal. Waiting, not wandering, suggested purpose. A delivery, a message, or something requiring conversation behind closed doors. The village's stillness seemed to pause, briefly, as though listening. Mrs. Hartwell tightened her grip on her handbag. "Perhaps I should go home," she murmured, scarcely louder than the rustle of her coat. "There are things to attend to." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Walk safely, dear." As Mrs. Hartwell departed, slipping into the narrow lane toward her ivy-covered cottage, Miss Marple noticed another detail: the hurried way the woman avoided looking at the churchyard gate, where frost still clung in elaborate whorls. There was a contained tension to her stride, as though she feared she might reveal too much simply by standing still. Miss Marple resumed her own walk toward the high street, but the air around her felt altered. St. Mary Mead remained outwardly calm, chimneys smoking softly, sparrows chattering in hedges, yet the earlier hint of unease had deepened into something more defined. A remark about frost, a constable at the vicarage, a woman unwilling to look at her own fear. Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. First a whisper, then a tremor, then a revelation that left the villagers murmuring for weeks. And though she did not yet know what shape the disturbance would take, she felt the village drawing a quiet breath, the kind held only when it is waiting for news. When she reached her gate, she paused, glancing back toward Mrs. Hartwell's lane. The sunlight had dimmed, clouds gathering with the inevitability of thought returning to its source. On her fingertips, she imagined the sensation of tracing frost, a cold that remembers touch longer than it should. Miss Marple stepped inside her cottage, the kettle already set to boil. Someone, she suspected, would call before long, and the window, the one with frost that looked like writing, would not be the last disturbance of the day. The soft whistle of Miss Marple's kettle had barely begun to hum when the expected knock arrived tentatively, as though the caller feared being the first to name an unease the village had not yet admitted aloud. Miss Marple moved toward the door with unhurried grace, opening it to find young Constable Willis standing on the step, cap in hand, cheeks pinked by the cold. His posture carried a respectful stiffness, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," he said, shifting his weight. "I was asked to inform certain neighbors. But perhaps the vicar thought you ought to hear sooner rather than later." Miss Marple inclined her head, neither alarmed nor dismissive, merely attentive. The silence between them settled like the thin frost lingering on the garden gate. Fragile, waiting. "There's been an incident at Mrs. Hartwell's cottage," Willis continued. "Not serious, we think, but unusual. The vicar found her rather distressed. She sent word asking that someone she trusts be informed." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing. Trust was not something Mrs. Hartwell bestowed lightly, nor would she summon the vicar without good reason. "Is she unwell?" "No, ma'am." "Shaken?" She said something had been disturbed. He hesitated, as though the words themselves felt precarious. "Inside the house." Miss Marple reached for her coat with a thoughtful nod. "Of course. Let us go at once." Outside, the air had grown sharper, a crisp bite that made the hedges glitter faintly. As they walked, Miss Marple sensed the village stirring behind curtains and doorways. A pair of elderly twins peered from their window, pretending to straighten lace. Mr. Larkin stood a moment too long adjusting the post-box latch. Even Mrs. Weatherby's cat watched with unusual solemnity from the vicarage wall. News or fear of it travels faster than footsteps in St. Mary Mead. Constable Willis kept his pace modest, conscious of Miss Marple's years, but unaware that she moved more steadily than most in the village. He cleared his throat once, twice, as though rehearsing something. She spared him the discomfort. "You mentioned Something was disturbed, she said gently. Did Mrs. Hartwell explain what she meant? Only that it relates to the window frost. And something in her sitting room. He glanced down the narrowing lane, lowering his voice. She said it. Looked like an intrusion, but nothing was stolen. Intrusion without theft, a message without words. Miss Marple tucked the observations into the quiet order of her mind, where the faintest pattern had begun to glimmer. As they approached, Mrs. Hartwell's cottage appeared painfully neat, ivy trimmed back carefully, curtains drawn just so. The vicar stood at the gate, hands clasped as though awaiting a difficult confession. His relief at seeing Miss Marple was unmistakable. Oh, thank goodness. She insists it is nothing, of course, but she is quite beside herself. I fear she mistrusts her own nerves. Miss Marple laid a reassuring hand on his arm. Most sensible people do, when properly frightened. Inside, the warmth felt strained, as though the room had been tidied in haste. Mrs. Hartwell rose from her armchair, her composure arranged with the precision of a freshly folded handkerchief. But her eyes, uncertain, glazed with the remnants of fear, betrayed her. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice thinner than usual. "It's silly, I know. Utterly silly." Miss Marple lowered herself into the chair opposite. "Why don't you tell me what happened, dear?" Mrs. Hartwell clasped her hands tightly. After returning from the parish hall, I went to check the breakfast room window. The frost patterns were still there, but when I stepped into the sitting room, her breath shivered slightly. Someone had moved the vase on the mantel. Only a few inches, but I always place it precisely in the center. Miss Marple allowed the smallest pause not doubt, but space for truth to gather. And was anything else disturbed? Yes. Mrs. Hartwell rose abruptly, crossing to the mantelpiece. This. She pointed to a framed photograph, an old sepia portrait of her late husband, handsome in his youth, his gaze steady and direct. The frame leaned slightly now, as though deliberately angled. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. The vicar attempted a soothing smile. A draught, perhaps, or vibrations from the passing lorry. Mrs. Hartwell shook her head with sudden vehemence. No, it was straight this morning. Perfectly straight. Miss Marple examined the room with gentle discretion, the polished surfaces, the symmetry of cushions, the absence of dust. Mrs. Hartwell lived her life like a series of small certainties, each object proving the world remained orderly. A shifted vase was no trivial matter here. It was a violation of the one sanctuary she trusted most. She turned slowly back to Mrs. Hartwell. "Has anyone been inside today besides yourself?" No one. The door was locked when I returned, but her eyes flickered upward, a tremor of memory surfacing. During the night I thought I heard something, a faint scrape, like someone brushing past the hedge outside. The vicar exchanged a worried glance with Constable Willis. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, moved elsewhere, not to the sound, but to the frost. Writing on glass. An intrusion within. Two disturbances, one at each threshold of her life. "What did the frost look like?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Hartwell hesitated. Like a handprint, pressed very lightly, but the fingers were too long. The silence that followed was taut and delicate, as if the room itself feared to breathe. Miss Marple did not flinch. Only a quiet shift of her gaze revealed her sharpening focus not on ghosts or imaginations, but on someone who understood precisely which details would unnerve a woman like Mrs. Hartwell. A thought stirred, faint but insistent, and Miss Marple felt the first glimmer of connection between the window and the mantelpiece, a pattern forming just beyond sight. The tremor of the room's silence lingered a heartbeat longer before Constable Willis stepped forward, his voice measured with the careful steadiness of a young man who hoped firmness might banish uncertainty. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'll take a proper look round the cottage, just to be sure everything's in order." He moved toward the hallway, though the faint hesitation in his step suggested he, too, felt the peculiar charge in the air. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back to Mrs. Hartwell, whose fingers worried the edge of a handkerchief. The woman's gaze drifted repeatedly to the skewed photograph, as though it were a wound she could not help reopening with her eyes. There was no melodrama in her distress, merely the brittle tension of someone who had built her life upon precision and now felt the edges of that certainty fraying. "Have you noticed anything else out of the ordinary?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Only that I felt watched," Mrs. Hartwell whispered. "Just these last 2 mornings, a sense of someone standing behind me, though of course no one was there." The vicar, attempting comfort, murmured reassurances about nerves and cold draughts, but Miss Marple's attention settled on the subtle detail beneath the words. People rarely describe feeling watched unless they have already suspected someone capable of watching. Before she could inquire further, Constable Willis returned from the corridor. "Doors and windows all secure," he announced. "No signs of tampering. Everything is quite as it should be." Yet his uncertainty betrayed that everything did not feel as it should be. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt with a serene deliberation that disguised the rising thread of inquiry in her mind. "Mrs. Hartwell, would you permit me a look at the frost pattern? It may provide a small comfort." The woman nodded, grateful for anything resembling certainty, and led them to the breakfast room. The window, still faintly silvered, caught the dim afternoon light. The frost had melted into patches, yet enough remained to hint at the earlier shape of elongated lines pressed lightly into the crystalline surface, too symmetrical to be accidental, yet too delicate to convey a clear intention. It looked less like a handprint and more like the ghost of something appearing human at a glance, yet subtly wrong. Miss Marple leaned in without touching the glass. "Curious," she murmured, not to startle but to ground the moment. Frost preserves impressions only briefly. Anything warm breath, gloved fingers, even a lingering touch would disturb the growth. Mrs. Hartwell's voice trembled. It was there at dawn. Miss Marple noted the time silently. Dawn impressions were intentional ones. She let her gaze drift outward to the hedge that lined the garden, its branches stiff with ice. Beneath it, faint marks traced the frost-hardened soil, not deep, yet definite. Someone had stood there. Someone light-footed. Constable Willis brightened at the discovery. "I can make a note of that. Perhaps a boy playing pranks." "Perhaps," Miss Marple echoed softly, though her tone suggested she considered the explanation polite rather than plausible. Boys rarely place their mischiefs at dawn, nor do they slip into locked cottages to tilt photographs. The vicar cleared his throat, returning to the warmth of the sitting room. "We must consider the possibility of a simple mistake, a misremembering. We all frighten ourselves at times, especially in winter. But Miss Marple had known Mrs. Hartwell for decades, a woman whose memory was as sharp as winter itself, and whose routine was as fixed as the church bell's hourly toll. The disturbance of objects in such a life was never trivial. Back in the sitting room, Mrs. Hartwell sank into her chair, the handkerchief crushed between her palms. "I don't know whom to suspect," she confessed. "There's no one who would wish me harm." "No one you believe would," Miss Marple corrected with a quiet kindness. "But people often surprise us, sometimes for good, sometimes otherwise." At that moment, a brisk knock sounded at the door. Mr. Larkin stepped inside immediately after the vicar's invitation, his expression a contradictory mixture of concern and embarrassment, as though he feared being caught overhearing the very conversation he sought to join. "Beg pardon," he said quickly. "Heard there might have been a disturbance. Thought I'd check if all's well." Mrs. Hartwell stiffened. "I'm sure the whole village knows by now," she muttered. Mr. Larkin colored slightly. "Only that you seemed upset earlier. I just wanted to see if I could help." Miss Marple watched him, noting the slight tremor in his hand as he removed his cap. Not fear exactly, but tension, as though he carried a worry he could not voice freely. His eyes flicked once toward the mantelpiece, then away. Too quick, too deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. Larkin," Miss Marple said warmly. "Your concern does you credit." His relief was visible, but short-lived. "Strange business, frost patterns," he added with forced cheer. "Weather plays tricks." He attempted a smile that faltered at the edges. Miss Marple offered a thoughtful nod, but her gaze lingered on the man's boots, the faint trace of dried mud along one side. Not unusual for a postmaster, except that it matched the color of the soil beneath Mrs. Hartwell's hedge. Mrs. Hartwell did not notice, too consumed by her own distress, but Miss Marple stored the detail quietly. Mud could mean many things. A postman walked everywhere. Yet it was curious that Mr. Larkin had arrived so swiftly, so conveniently aware of the situation, and with such an anxious eagerness to appear helpful. Constable Willis, eager to regain authority, began assuring the room that patrols would be increased. The vicar suggested prayer. Mrs. Hartwell murmured gratitude. The atmosphere shifted a fraction in the first fragile attempt at restoring normalcy. But Miss Marple's eyes returned once more to the tilted photograph, to the subtle wrongness embedded in its new angle. A message had been delivered here today, veiled in frost and silence. And the person who delivered it might be standing much closer than anyone wished to imagine. Mr. Larkin's uneasy smile had barely settled before he excused himself, stepping out into the cold with a haste that attempted politeness but landed closer to retreat. The front door clicked shut in a tone that felt too light for the weight of his departure, and the room exhaled a collective breath, though no one wished to admit it. Constable Willis straightened, as though the closing door restored some order. "Well," he said, "I'll finish my notes outside. Best check the hedge again while there's still light." His boots thudded softly along the hall, leaving Miss Marple with the vicar and Mrs. Hartwell in a silence that hovered between relief and hidden dread. Mrs. Hartwell's gaze trailed toward the mantelpiece once more. "He seemed nervous," she murmured. "Did you see? He hardly looked at me." The vicar offered a gentle objection, though his hesitance betrayed doubt. The poor man is simply anxious not to intrude. These little incidents take the village by surprise. Miss Marple, observing the interplay of denial and dawning suspicion, moved toward the mantel with unhurried calm. The photograph, still angled, seemed almost to study the room rather than be part of it, a silent witness to a disturbance no one yet understood. She touched nothing, merely let her eyes linger on the tilt, then on the polished wood where faint smudges suggested recent handling. "Mrs. Hartwell," she asked softly, "did Mr. Larkin ever call here unannounced? Perhaps with the post or a message?" "Only once or twice," the woman replied. "Years ago. He knows I prefer letters placed neatly through the slot." Her voice caught on the word prefer, revealing the fragile thread of control she feared losing. The vicar clasped his hands. "We mustn't leap to conclusions. Mr. Larkin is a respectable man. His father before him was the same." "Respectability," Miss Marple said gently, "has never been the same thing as goodness, nor does nervousness signify guilt, only that someone is troubled." The vicar sighed as if chastened by her quiet wisdom. Outside the window, Constable Willis bent beneath the hedge, his figure half silhouetted against the chill afternoon. He scribbled notes, occasionally pausing to inspect the ground. The faint traces of footprints remained ambiguous, too light for certainty, too deliberate for innocence. Snow melt from the morning frost had softened them, erasing edges as though someone wished to remain only partly seen. When Willis returned, his expression was earnest. Distinct impressions, but could be anyone who took the lane. Hard to be sure. His tone leaned toward the easiest conclusion that there was nothing definite here after all. Miss Marple heard the unspoken plea to let the matter rest, let the village resume its tidy peace, but she also heard the false note within it. Fear disguised as reason. "Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Larkin?" Miss Marple asked, as though purely curious. The young constable blinked. "Mr. Larkin? Well, he did ask a good many questions for someone just offering help. Wanted to know whether we'd found prints on the sill, how long the frost had been there, whether anything had been taken. That sort of thing." A faint line appeared between his brows. Thinking back, he seemed more informed than I'd expected. Mrs. Hartwell's breath caught. "You don't suppose," Miss Marple intervened with a calm, measured tone. "We suppose nothing. Curiosity may be guilt, or it may be fear. And fear, Constable, makes people observe more keenly than they intend." Yet even as she spoke, she felt the shift in the room, the first scent of a suspect forming, delicate as the frost patterns on the window. Not firm, not proven, but present. Constable Willis stepped aside as Mrs. Hartwell rose, drawn once more to the mantelpiece. Her fingers trembled as she straightened the photograph, restoring symmetry with almost desperate relief. "I can't bear it askew," she whispered. "It makes the whole room feel wrong." Miss Marple watched her, noting the gesture, the need to realign something that had been touched without permission. A symbolic restoration, though not a repair of the deeper disturbance. "You said your husband liked things in order," Miss Marple said softly. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Hartwell replied, her voice softening with memory. "He was meticulous. He hated intrusions of any kind. He used to say, if something is moved without reason, someone has crossed a line." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "And someone has." The vicar, sensing the weight of her words, approached with a gentle pastoral tone. "My dear, perhaps you should stay with a neighbor tonight." "For comfort, nothing more." "No," Mrs. Hartwell said quickly. "I won't leave my home. That's precisely what someone might want." A tremor returned to her voice, not fear alone, but pride wounded by violation. Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sympathy. "Then you must not be alone. Perhaps invite someone to stay. Mrs. Price Ridley or Miss Hartnell." Mrs. Hartwell shuddered. "I'd rather sleep in the church vestry than endure Mrs. Price Ridley's opinions." A faint smile touched Miss Marple's lips. Quite understandable. Constable Willis, sensing his moment to reclaim authority, cleared his throat. "I'll arrange an evening patrol near the lane, and I'll speak with Mr. Larkin again. Just a routine chat." Mrs. Hartwell's hands tightened around her handkerchief. "Ask him why he came so quickly," she whispered. Miss Marple noted the question significant, not for its accusation, but for the fact it had occurred to her at all. Fear alters perception, yet sometimes it sharpens it. As the constable departed once more, the failing light cast a thin wash of pale gold across the mantelpiece. The freshly straightened photograph stood upright again, but its brief misalignment had left a faint imprint of a diagonal shadow where dust had not yet settled back into place. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on that shadow. Something or someone had crossed a line, and in the stillness that followed, another possibility rose in her mind. Subtle and unsettling, like frost beginning to reform on the edge of a windowpane. A possibility that suggested the disturbance was not meant to frighten Mrs. Hartwell alone. The faint shadow beneath the photograph still held Miss Marple's attention when Mrs. Hartwell stepped back from the mantel, as though distance might restore the room's moral symmetry. The vicar murmured something soothing, but his eyes flicked uneasily toward the door through which Constable Willis had disappeared. Outside, footsteps crunched along the lane, the constable returning to his patrol, or perhaps someone else listening at a careful distance. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room once more, alighting briefly on the narrow writing desk by the window. Its surface was immaculate, save for a single sheet of notepaper tucked half-concealed beneath a blotter. A corner protruded just enough to reveal a faint smudge of graphite. Such small irregularities in a house as meticulously kept as Mrs. Hartwell's were as telling as footprints in fresh snow. "Did you write letters this morning?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Hartwell startled slightly. "No." "Why?" Miss Marple gestured lightly toward the desk. "Something appears to have been moved." The woman crossed quickly to the desk, lifting the blotter. Underneath lay a page from a notepad, its top edge ragged, its center mottled with the pressure of a pencil that had written upon a now absent sheet. The indentations were faint, but unmistakably deliberate. Lines, curves, perhaps letters, the ghost of a message removed. "I didn't do this," Mrs. Hartwell whispered. Her fingers trembled as she traced the impressions without touching them. "Someone wrote here, 'In my house.'" The vicar attempted to intervene. "Perhaps you jotted something down and forgot." "Forgot?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice sharpened. "I do not forget my own handwriting, nor tear out pages untidily. And look here," she pointed to the indentation that curved like the tail of a letter. "This is not mine." Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, careful not to cast too strong a shadow across the page. The markings were faint, but certain strokes suggested a hand accustomed to quick writing, perhaps masculine or simply hurried. The letters might have formed part of a name or merely a word beginning with a downward flourish. And most telling of all, the page beneath had been pressed unevenly, as though written in haste by someone standing rather than sitting. "People sometimes steady themselves with one hand," Miss Marple said, noting the faint smear where a thumb might have rested, particularly if they fear discovery. Mrs. Hartwell gripped the back of the chair. "Then someone was here longer than we thought." The vicar's brows drew together. "But why write something and take it away? Why leave the impressions behind?" Miss Marple's mind moved quietly, the way frost creeps along the edge of a pane slowly, revealing a pattern only once one steps back. Perhaps they did not intend to leave any trace. People forget how paper remembers, much like people themselves. Mrs. Hartwell sank into her chair, pressing the handkerchief to her lips. "This is dreadful. Who would do such a thing?" The vicar began offering the usual platitudes, but Miss Marple watched Mrs. Hartwell instead, not her panic, but the direction of her gaze. Each time she looked away, it was toward the little table by the window, where a small ornamental box lay closed. A simple wooden thing, darkened with age. "Is something troubling you about that box?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Hartwell blinked, startled. "The box? No. It's just a keepsake." "Your husband's?" She hesitated. "Yes, he kept a few private notes in it. Nothing of consequence." But her voice lacked conviction, as though she had hurriedly chosen the least revealing truth. Miss Marple filed the reaction away. Secrets often lived not in the object itself, but in the way a person shielded it. Before she could inquire further, there came another knock at the front door, brisk, insistent, almost relieved. Mrs. Weatherby bustled in at the vicar's invitation, cheeks ruddy, breath puffing in little clouds. "I came as soon as I heard," she declared, smoothing her hat. "Poor dear, are you quite all right? Such talk flying about. Frost writing, disturbed rooms, and Mr. Larkin rushing about like a hen chased by the butcher." Mrs. Hartwell stiffened. "Mr. Larkin? What has he been saying?" "Oh, nothing scandalous," Mrs. Weatherby said breezily, though her eyes sparkled with the thrill of near gossip. "Only that he saw a stranger by the lane last night. Tall fellow," he said, wrapped in a dark coat. Couldn't see the face." The room stilled. Miss Marple felt the shift immediately, the introduction of a new shape in the landscape of suspicion. A stranger offered an easy explanation. Tidy and comforting, almost too comforting. "Did he describe the man further?" Miss Marple asked. "Only that he moved quickly," Mrs. Weatherby replied, "and that he seemed to be watching the cottages. But really, you know, how men like to dramatize." Miss Marple knew precisely the opposite men in St. Mary Mead preferred to downplay fear, not embellish it, which made Mr. Larkin's eagerness to mention a stranger rather interesting indeed. Mrs. Hartwell's distress deepened. Why would a stranger watch my house? What could he want? Miss Marple laid a delicate hand on her arm. Often, my dear, the simplest explanation is that he wished to see whether someone was home. People reveal much by absence or presence, but inside her own thoughts, the pattern tightened. A stranger introduced by the very man whose muddy boots led toward the hedge. A note written hastily and removed. A box guarded by instinct, not reason. Appearances and truth. Respectability and fear. The frost on the window, the dust shadow on the mantel, the imprint on the paper are all variations of the same idea, things barely touched, yet subtly altered. Mrs. Weatherby, oblivious to the undercurrents, prattled on about the church choir's rehearsal. But Mrs. Hartwell barely listened. Her eyes had drifted once more to the wooden box, and Miss Marple, observing that quiet, involuntary motion, felt something resolve with a soft, inevitable click, not a solution, but the awareness that the disturbance in this cottage was rooted deeper than frost and footprints. "Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently, "may I ask what exactly is kept inside that box?" The woman's breath caught. Behind her silence lay the next shape of the mystery waiting to emerge like a message pressed into frost. Mrs. Hartwell's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief as though it might anchor her against the question. The small wooden box on the table seemed to command the entire room's attention, its polished surface reflecting a faint glimmer of pale winter light. Miss Marple did not press further. She merely waited, the way a gardener waits for a bud to open in its own time. "It's nothing important," Mrs. Hartwell said at last, though the tremor beneath the words spoke otherwise. "Just old notes of my husband's work. He was a careful man. He kept lists of everything, household inventories, repairs needed, the like." Miss Marple observed the hesitation that accompanied the small, telling pause that suggested a detail omitted, perhaps not out of deceit, but out of reluctance. The vicar, sensing discomfort, moved to divert the moment. "My dear," he said gently, "if the box causes you distress, we can simply leave it be. You've been through enough." But Mrs. Hartwell shook her head with sudden resolve. "No. If someone was in my house long enough to write a note, they might have touched this." She reached for the box with a small, decisive movement. Her fingers lifted the lid, revealing neatly arranged slips of paper, folded with the precision of a methodical mind. But atop them lay something unexpected. A small envelope, cream-colored, unaddressed, the flap unsealed. Mrs. Hartwell frowned and drew it out, her lips parting in confusion. "I've never seen this." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "May I?" At the woman's nod, she examined the envelope with delicate care. No handwriting, no stamp, no monogram, only the faintest indentation on the front, a pressure mark like the curve of a letter begun but not completed. Inside lay a single folded sheet torn from a notepad, the same textured paper that bore the indentations on the desk. Mrs. Hartwell unfolded it, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow around the four people gathered in the small sitting room. The paper was blank. No message, no threat, no signature. Just an absence that felt more deliberate than any written word. "It must have been meant for you," Mrs. Hartwell murmured, her voice thin. "But why blank? Why leave nothing?" Miss Marple's eyes softened with a reflective calm. Sometimes a blank page carries its own meaning. One chooses not to speak, or not yet to reveal. Her fingers traced the torn top edge of the sheet, and sometimes her voice lowered a person removes what they fear to leave behind. Mrs. Weatherby, hovering with a mixture of eagerness and trepidation, leaned closer. But who would take the trouble to write something, tear it out, and then leave an empty envelope? It's unnatural. It is human, Miss Marple replied quietly, when one wishes to appear innocent. Mrs. Hartwell stared at the paper, its whiteness almost luminous against her trembling hands. They came here to frighten me. Miss Marple hesitated, or perhaps to remind you of something. At that, Mrs. Hartwell closed the box abruptly, as though the very air around it had grown too revealing. Her composure fractured again, not with panic, but with a deeper, more personal dread. The vicar placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "My dear, if there is anything you wish to tell us, anything at all, we can help." Mrs. Hartwell shook her head. "I don't know what it means. Truly, I don't." Miss Marple believed the distress, but not the ignorance. Before the moment could settle, Constable Willis reappeared at the doorway, his breath visible in the cold draught behind him. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice as though reluctant to disturb the fragile calm of the room, "might I have a word?" "Outside, please." The vicar nodded for her to go, and Miss Marple followed the constable into the lane. The air had grown colder, the faint sunlight fading into a muted grey. Frost clung stubbornly to the hedge as if afraid to melt fully. Willis looked troubled. "I spoke with Mr. Larkin just now. He claims he saw that stranger again. Says the man was near the churchyard gate this morning early, before anyone else was awake." Miss Marple studied his expression. "And do you believe him, Constable?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. He seemed eager, too eager, as though he wanted me to be convinced." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Fear sometimes urges people to exaggerate. But so does guilt. Willis exhaled, clouding the air. "What bothers me is that he kept asking whether Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned anything missing." He repeated the question twice. "And did he ask about the note?" Miss Marple inquired. The constable looked startled. "How did you do?" "Yes, he did." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the cottage window, where the frost had begun to glisten again in the dimming light. A stranger was convenient, a nervous postmaster less so, and somewhere beneath the surface of these interwoven fears lay a truth attempting to take shape like a message slowly emerging beneath a layer of frost. "Constable," Miss Marple said softly, "did Mr. Larkin mention whether he had called on Mrs. Hartwell recently? Within the last week, perhaps?" Willis frowned. "No, ma'am. He insisted he hadn't spoken to her except for exchanging a greeting at the post office last Tuesday." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed the slightest fraction. Last Tuesday, the day Mrs. Hartwell had been seen leaving the shop in visible agitation. She remembered it clearly now, the woman clutching a package too tightly, her expression taut, avoiding conversation. "Miss Marple," Willis asked, "have you thought of something?" Her thoughts moved quietly, aligning possibilities without yet drawing conclusions. Only what appears to be intrusion may instead be a response. The young constable looked puzzled. Miss Marple offered him a gentle, reassuring smile. "But it is too soon to say." She turned back toward the cottage, the frost whispering beneath her steps. Mrs. Hartwell waited inside anxious, withholding something not out of deception, but out of private fear. And just before Miss Marple reached the door, she paused, catching sight of a faint movement at the far end of the lane, a figure stepping behind a hedge, unseen but not entirely hidden. A subtle shift, a quiet tremor across the surface of events, enough to deepen the mystery. The faint movement at the end of the lane lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a half-formed word on chilled glass. She stepped back inside the cottage, shaking the frost from her sleeve, and found the atmosphere altered, not calmer, but suspended, as though each person in the room sensed something approaching but dared not name it. Mrs. Hartwell sat rigidly in her chair, the wooden box closed and pushed aside with deliberate precision. Mrs. Weatherby hovered nearby, torn between offering comfort and gathering conversational scraps for later retelling. The vicar attempted mild reassurance, though his eyes betrayed unease. When Miss Marple re-entered, all three turned toward her with an unspoken question. "Constable Willis is making further inquiries," she said gently, removing her gloves. "He will return shortly." Mrs. Hartwell nodded, though her hands remained tightly clasped. Did he see the stranger again? I'm afraid he did not. But he is attentive. Miss Marple let the reassurance rest lightly. It would not do to reinforce shadows where facts remained uncertain. A sudden gust rattled the windowpane, drawing all eyes toward the frost-glazed glass. The waning light deepened the room's shadows, giving the sitting room a faintly theatrical air, as though something behind the curtains waited to step forward. "I'd like some air," Mrs. Hartwell murmured, rising with surprising abruptness. "Just a moment on the threshold." The vicar made to accompany her, but Miss Marple intervened with a small, kind gesture. "Allow her a moment alone. Sometimes a breath of cold helps steady one's thoughts." Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips, unconvinced but compliant. Mrs. Hartwell opened the front door and stepped out, her figure briefly silhouetted against the graying sky. Miss Marple watched her through the parted curtains, noting the stiffness of her shoulders, the way she stared toward the hedge as though expecting someone to emerge from its shelter. A minute passed, then another, and then a sharp cry cut through the stillness, not loud, but tight with fear. Miss Marple moved quickly for her age, the vicar close behind. Mrs. Hartwell stood at the edge of the path, one hand clamped to her mouth, the other pointing toward the hedge where the lane curved out of sight. "It's there," she whispered, "on the ground." Miss Marple followed her gaze and saw it. Half hidden beneath a cluster of frost-tipped leaves lay a glove, a man's glove, dark leather, expensive, worn at the fingertips, and beside it, as though placed deliberately, a narrow scrap of paper caught under a twig, its edge fluttering faintly in the cold breeze. Miss Marple crouched with care, picking up the glove first. "Has this ever belonged to your husband?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Hartwell recoiled. "No, he never wore gloves like that." Miss Marple turned the glove over. The inside lining was soft wool, and a faint scent clung to it, tobacco, perhaps, or the ghost of it, a habit concealed or indulged out of sight. The scrap of paper came next. When she lifted it, the village seemed to hold its breath. The torn edge matched the sheet from the box. Across the paper, written in hurried, jagged pencil strokes, were 3 words you were seen. Mrs. Weatherby gasped, one hand flying to her chest. Well, who could that be meant for? The vicar frowned deeply. "This is a threat. It must be reported at once." Mrs. Hartwell swayed slightly, and Miss Marple guided her gently back toward the doorway. "Come inside, my dear. The cold will do you no good." Once seated again, Mrs. Hartwell stared at the message with a hollow dread. Someone is tormenting me. Someone who knows my house, my habits, and my fears. Miss Marple studied her closely. Not necessarily tormenting, Mrs. Hartwell, but someone wishes to remind you of something. "What could I possibly know?" she cried softly. "I've done nothing." Miss Marple offered a delicate, sympathetic smile. Sometimes trouble finds us through the shadows of others' actions, not our own. Mrs. Weatherby seized her moment. Could it be that stranger Mr. Larkin mentioned? A tall man in a dark coat perhaps lost his glove fleeing the lane. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, though the tone carried quiet doubt, but if he wished to hide, he would not leave his belongings behind. The vicar cleared his throat. "Then someone wishes to be noticed." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with approval. "Exactly, Reverend. Whoever left the glove and note did not attempt subtlety. They wished for them to be found by Mrs. Hartwell in particular." Mrs. Hartwell's fingers trembled. "But why? What have I to do with any of this?" Miss Marple glanced once more at the wooden box. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said gently, "I know you believe there is nothing inside that would interest anyone, but you hesitated earlier when I asked about it. Is there something you fear might cause misunderstanding? A silence stretched, delicate and fragile. Mrs. Hartwell lowered her gaze. There is one thing, she whispered. Not a crime. Nothing shameful. But something my husband wished kept private. She pressed her lips together. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Miss Marple waited, knowing the story would unfold only when the woman could bear to speak it. But before the words emerged, the front gate creaked sharply, a hurried step, not Constable Willis's steady tread, but something lighter, brisker, anxious. Miss Marple rose just as the knock struck the door rapid, insistent, carrying its own urgency. And she knew at once that whatever Mrs. Hartwell feared revealing was about to be complicated by whoever stood outside. The urgent knock seemed to reverberate through the small sitting room, tugging every occupant into alert stillness. Miss Marple reached the door with composed steps, though she felt the tension ripple behind Mrs. Weatherby's eager inhale, the vicar's concerned frown, and Mrs. Hartwell's trembling anticipation. When she opened the door, Mr. Larkin stood on the threshold, flushed from haste, breath coming in shallow bursts. His cap was askew, and his eyes darted past Miss Marple toward the cottage interior. I heard he began, then stopped short, catching sight of Mrs. Hartwell pale and stricken by the hearth. Is she all right? Is anything else amiss? His concern was real, but it vibrated with an edge too sharp to pass unnoticed. Miss Marple stepped aside to let him enter, though she watched him carefully as he crossed the room. His gaze flickered toward the mantelpiece, then toward the wooden box, both glances quick, almost reflexive. "What brings you back, Mr. Larkin?" the vicar asked, attempting cordiality. "I saw someone running down the lane," he said, smoothing his cap with restless fingers. "Tall man, dark coat. Same one I mentioned earlier. I thought he must have come this way." His voice strained between helpfulness and fear, or perhaps something more complicated. Mrs. Weatherby seized the moment. "You see, Reverend." The stranger again. Mr. Larkin swallowed. "Yes, well, I thought I ought to warn you. It seemed wrong not to." Miss Marple regarded him with a delicate calm. "That was thoughtful, though you arrived rather quickly. Did you happen to be nearby?" He stiffened. "I'd just left the post office." "On a Sunday," Mrs. Weatherby blurted, then flushed at her own incautious tone. Mr. Larkin's face reddened. "There's sorting to be done, weather delays, holiday deliveries." His explanation came too fast, like a man bolstering his own certainty as much as theirs. Mrs. Hartwell, hands still trembling, lifted the glove from the table. "Was this left by the man you saw?" Mr. Larkin stared at it, too long to be natural. "Could be," he murmured. "Hard to say. Leather gloves many men have." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "Yet this one carries a particular scent." She held it slightly nearer. "Tobacco. A strong blend." The vicar's brows lifted. "You don't smoke, do you, Mr. Larkin?" He hesitated. "No. Well, occasionally. Only now and then." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened. "Oh, I didn't know." "It's private," he snapped, then caught himself. "I mean, I prefer not to broadcast my habits." Miss Marple watched him quietly. People reveal themselves most clearly when they are trying not to. Mrs. Hartwell rose shakily. "Mr. Larkin, have you been near my house these past nights? Has something happened you haven't told us?" "No." The denial burst out too forcefully. "I'd no reason to come here." "Why would I?" Miss Marple let the silence settle, letting him drown or resurface in his own words. "Perhaps you were concerned," she offered softly. "You seemed earlier to know much about the frost pattern." He stiffened. "I only wished to help." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said, "you can help by telling us whether you recognize this." She unfolded the scrap of paper, the jagged pencil strokes still raw upon its surface. "You were seen." Mr. Larkin's reaction carried an unmistakable flicker, not of guilt, not quite fear, but recognition. Something in the shape of the words, the hurried style, or their intention struck home. The vicar leaned forward. "Do you know who might have written that?" "Of course not. It's absurd." But his voice wavered. Mrs. Weatherby gasped softly. "Mr. Larkin, does this stranger have something to do with you?" He flared. "I told you I saw him by the churchyard. That's all?" But the tremor in his stance belied the simplicity of his statement. Miss Marple stepped toward him with gentleness rather than accusation. "Fear can take many forms, Mr. Larkin. Sometimes it causes us to see threats where none exist. Sometimes it causes us to hide truths we fear will be misinterpreted." His shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked very small, a man pressed between duty and dread. "I didn't want to be dragged into anything," he whispered. "Not after last week." Mrs. Hartwell stiffened. "Last week?" Mr. Larkin swallowed hard. "I saw you at the post office, Mrs. Hartwell. You were receiving a parcel, brown paper tied with string. You looked distressed." Mrs. Hartwell paled. "That has nothing to do with, but someone saw you open it," he added quietly. "Outside, in the lane." The room froze. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Hartwell closely. "My dear, what was in the parcel?" Mrs. Hartwell pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "It was nothing, truly nothing." Miss Marple waited, her silence more encouraging than any question. Finally, Mrs. Hartwell whispered, "It was a letter, anonymous. My husband's name is written on the outside, and inside a note saying he had betrayed someone. Years ago." The vicar inhaled sharply. "But that's impossible. Your husband was an honorable man." "I burned it," Mrs. Hartwell whispered. "I thought it was a cruel joke. But now I don't know." Mr. Larkin spoke softly. "I saw someone slipping away just as you dropped the ashes. That same tall fellow, coat collar turned up." Mrs. Weatherby clucked uneasily. "Oh, this grows worse by the minute." Miss Marple felt the threads crossing a note burned, another written and removed, messages in frost, objects disturbed, shadows at dawn. A pattern was forming, but the shape was not yet clear enough to reveal. She turned once more to the window. Outside, the frost thickened along the edge of the glass, forming new delicate lines, as though the cold itself attempted to write something unsaid. And Miss Marple, following those faint crystalline strokes, felt a small, quiet shift somewhere deep in her thoughts. A forming connection, elusive but persistent. The frost, tracing the window's edge, continued its silent, delicate bloom as Miss Marple stepped back from the glass, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Behind her, the room murmured with subdued agitation, Mrs. Weatherby whispering half-thoughts, the vicar attempting calm, and Mrs. Hartwell breathing in small, uneven gasps. Mr. Larkin stood rigid, his cap twisting between anxious fingers. None of them noticed the soft shift in Miss Marple's expression, the quiet recognition of something subtle sliding into place. She turned gently toward Mrs. Hartwell. "My dear, this anonymous letter, did you recognize the handwriting?" Mrs. Hartwell shook her head. "No." It was uneven, as if the writer meant to disguise it, but the words felt personal. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze contemplative. "And the accusation against your husband you believed was false?" "I wanted to," Mrs. Hartwell whispered. "But after everything today, I cannot be certain." The vicar stepped forward, voice firm with pastoral insistence. "You must not torment yourself, my dear. The dead cannot defend themselves, and malicious tongues seek easy prey." Miss Marple's lips curved, not in disagreement, but in quiet thought. "Sometimes," she said softly, "a message is meant not to accuse, but to drive someone toward a reaction." Mr. Larkin shifted uneasily. If the stranger saw her burn it, maybe he thought she hid something important. Maybe he's come back to look. Or, Miss Marple replied, perhaps he wished her to believe he saw something whether he did or not. The postmaster swallowed hard. But why involve me? I've done nothing. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes glinted. You seemed awfully nervous earlier when Constable Willis asked about the frost. Because I didn't want trouble, he snapped, colour rising. People jump to conclusions, and I didn't want them jumping to me. Miss Marple approached him with almost grandmotherly kindness. Mr. Larkin, do you recall precisely what the man was doing by the churchyard? Did he stand, walk, linger? The question, so mild in tone, struck home with pointed accuracy. Mr. Larkin hesitated. He was watching, just standing there. At the gate. Facing which direction? Miss Marple asked quietly. Larkin blinked. Toward the lane. Not toward the church? No. The lane. Miss Marple inclined her head. Curious. Most strangers drawn to a churchyard look toward the headstones, not the hedges. Mrs. Weatherby's mouth formed a small O, delighted by the new implication. Mr. Larkin looked stricken. Are you saying I imagined him? Not at all, Miss Marple said. Only what one sees is shaped by what one fears, or expects. Before Larkin could reply, Constable Willis reappeared at the doorway, stamping frost from his boots. I've checked the lane again. No sign of the man. He paused, taking in the tense atmosphere. What's happening now? Mr. Larkin thrust the glove forward. Show him. Tell him what you found. Willis examined it with a frown. Leather. Good quality. Could be from anyone. But the note? His gaze hardened. This is no prank. Mrs. Hartwell flinched. Do you think I'm in danger? We'll keep an eye out, Willis promised, though the uncertainty behind his assurance was unmistakable. Miss Marple stepped forward, drawing the constable aside. Mr. Willis, you may find this curious. Mr. Larkin claims he saw a stranger, yet his description changes slightly each time. That often suggests not deceit, but interpretation. Willis frowned. You think he misunderstood what he saw? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that fear paints its own shadows. She let the idea settle before adding, but something more practical concerns me. The glove was found too easily, almost placed. Willis's eyes widened. You think someone planted it? It feels so, Miss Marple replied. People who wish not to be seen are careful with their belongings. People who wish to be noticed, less so. Constable Willis glanced toward the cottage, troubled. Then whoever left it wanted to escalate things. Miss Marple offered a rare, firm nod. Precisely. She stepped back to the room, her gaze sweeping across the faces before her. Mrs. Hartwell pale and shaken, Mrs. Weatherby avid and watchful, the vicar troubled, Mr. Larkin fidgeting with a guilt that had no clear shape yet. The web of suspicion had grown thick, but beneath it lay something more delicate, a misdirection, a deliberate shifting of attention. Miss Marple clasped her hands. I believe, she said calmly, that we should each retire to our homes for a short while. Anxiety breeds confusion, and clarity requires space. Mrs. Hartwell looked terrified. But what if someone returns? You will not be alone, Miss Marple assured her. Mrs. Weatherby will stay with you, won't you? Mrs. Weatherby brightened at the implied responsibility. Of course. And the vicar will be close at hand, Miss Marple added. Constable Willis straightened. I'll walk the lane. And I, Miss Marple said gently, will pay a visit or two. Mr. Larkin shifted nervously. To whom? To those, Miss Marple replied, with a serene, unreadable smile, who may help us understand what appears to be hidden. Her tone, mild yet purposeful, carried an unmistakable current at the beginning of a quiet, precise test, the kind she constructed when human motives needed gentle nudging into the light. As she reached for her coat, something flickered across Mrs. Hartwell's face. A memory, a fear, or a realization not yet spoken. A soft gasp almost escaped her before she pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple turned, noticing the gesture. "Mrs. Hartwell," she asked softly, "did something just occur to you?" The woman faltered, eyes widening, but the words did not come. Not yet. But Miss Marple saw the shift. Something had surfaced, and soon it would demand to be named. The unspoken realization that flickered across Mrs. Hartwell's features remained suspended in the air, fragile as the frost threading back across the windowpane. Miss Marple held the woman's gaze a moment longer, sensing the tremble of a truth struggling to surface, then softened her expression with reassuring gentleness. "You need not speak of it now, my dear," she said quietly. "But when the moment feels right, clarity will help us all." Mrs. Hartwell lowered her handkerchief, eyes shimmering with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I don't know what it is I've remembered." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "Memories often emerge shyly. We must let them settle." The vicar murmured a prayerful agreement, while Mrs. Weatherby busied herself with straightening a cushion already perfectly aligned. Mr. Larkin hovered awkwardly, his face caught between worry and guilt. Miss Marple watched him for a moment, noting the restlessness that possessed him, the way his foot tapped, how his fingers twitched toward the door as though torn between staying and escaping. "Mr. Larkin," she said gently, "perhaps you would walk with Constable Willis for a short while. It might comfort you both." He blinked, taken aback. "But I've nothing to hide." "No one suggested you did," Miss Marple replied with serene neutrality. "But you seem troubled, and company eases troubled minds." Willis, returning at that moment, caught the implication and nodded. "I could use another pair of eyes on the lane." Mr. Larkin hesitated, then relented. "All right, if it helps." They departed into the cold, their silhouettes quickly swallowed by the fading light. Miss Marple gathered her coat and scarf with unhurried precision. "I shall return shortly, Mrs. Hartwell," she said, offering a gentle hand to the woman's shoulder. "Mrs. Weatherby will remain with you, and the vicar is but a breath away." Mrs. Weatherby puffed herself up in protective importance. "She won't be alone, Miss Marple, not at all." Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind of smile that seemed to carry its own quiet plan. Outside, the air was sharper and carried a bite of deepening evening. Frost outlined every twig, every leaf, making the entire lane look as though it had been sketched in thin white strokes. Miss Marple walked with careful steps, her eyes attuned to the subtleties of the village's shifting mood. The curtains that fluttered closed as she passed, the way the hedge rustled with more than wind, and the faint, lingering scent of tobacco near the post office corner. She did not pause. Her destination required calm purpose, not hurried suspicion. A short walk brought her to the Larkin residence, a modest house, tidy yet worn by years of quiet bachelor habits. She glanced discreetly at the flower bed beneath the dining room window. Fresh impressions marked the soil, not deep, but recent. Someone had stood here, watching. Miss Marple filed it away and continued toward the vicarage, where she found the Reverend Clement stepping out to light his lantern. "Miss Marple," he greeted warmly. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." "I find," she said gently, "that the nearer one draws to clarity, the more one must observe the smaller details." The vicar's brow knitted. "You suspect something grave?" Miss Marple's expression softened with thoughtful ambiguity. "I suspect something human, and human matters are always grave to someone." He gestured for her to join him inside the vicarage hall, where the air was warmer and smelled faintly of candle wax. Miss Marple removed her gloves with care. "Reverend," she began, "you have known Mrs. Hartwell a long while. Did her husband leave any unfinished business, matters handled quietly, debts of a personal or moral nature?" The vicar looked startled. Good heavens, no. Arthur Hartwell was the very image of propriety. Careful to a fault. Careful people. Miss Marple murmured, often take great pains to protect reputations of their own or others, and those protections may linger long after. The vicar sighed. If only she had told me more about this anonymous letter. It troubles me deeply. Miss Marple nodded. It troubles her, too. Enough that someone may believe she holds something of value. Value, he repeated. Surely not money. Not money, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Information. A soft, troubled silence followed. The vicar's eyes widened slowly as her meaning formed. You think the intruder seeks something her husband left behind, or believes such a thing exists, she replied. Belief, even mistaken belief, can drive people to curious behaviors. The vicar clasped his hands, voice low. And the stranger Mr. Larkin claims to have seen. Miss Marple's smile held both sympathy and quiet irony. There are, Reverend, a few strangers in villages, only people we have not yet recognized. At that moment, a soft tapping echoed at the vicarage window, not loud enough to alarm, but persistent enough to draw notice. The vicar moved first, lifting the curtain slightly. Oh, he said, startled. It's young Tommy Larkin. Miss Marple stepped closer. Mr. Larkin's nephew, a lanky boy of 17 with earnest eyes and a perpetual air of apology, stood outside, shifting from foot to foot. When the vicar opened the door, Tommy removed his cap and looked anxiously between them. I'm sorry, he blurted. I wasn't sure who else to tell. Miss Marple regarded him with patient curiosity. Tell what, dear? Tommy swallowed hard. I saw Uncle Henry last night, near Mrs. Hartwell's lane. He didn't see me. He was carrying something, a little box, I think. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly, not in surprise, but in confirmation of something quietly anticipated. What kind of box? She asked gently. Tommy hesitated. Wooden, small, like one someone might keep important things in. Her eyes softened. And what did he do with it? The boy's answer trembled in the cold air. He put it back under his coat when he heard someone coming, and then he walked away fast. Toward the churchyard. The vicar drew a sharp breath. Miss Marple only nodded, her expression calm and grave. The shape of the truth was beginning to emerge delicate, incomplete, but unmistakably real. Tommy's confession hung in the vicarage hallway, its quiet urgency echoing far louder than any accusation spoken outright. Miss Marple regarded the boy with a look of gentle steadiness, as though she feared any abrupt movement might cause him to withhold something vital. Thank you, Tommy, she said softly. You were quite right to tell us. The boy shifted, relief softening his tense shoulders. I didn't want Uncle Henry to be in trouble. But he's been so strange lately. Nervous, jumping at sounds. I thought maybe he was mixed up in something he didn't mean to be. Miss Marple offered a small nod. People sometimes stumble into secrets when they never meant to. And sometimes, her voice lowered, they try to protect others from the consequences. The vicar looked stricken. Miss Marple, what are you thinking? Only that the threads of this puzzle are beginning to align, she said gently. We must follow them carefully. She thanked Tommy, sending him home with reassuring instructions. As the boy vanished into the frosted dusk, Miss Marple wrapped her scarf more tightly. I must speak with Henry Larkin, she murmured. The vicar hesitated. Do you think he will tell you the truth? He will, she replied quietly, when he realizes concealment no longer serves the person he is trying to protect. They walked together toward the lane, their footsteps muffled by the fine crust of frost reforming across the ground. Lamps flickered to life in cottage windows, one by one, casting soft squares of amber onto the whitening paths. The night seemed to listen. Ahead, Constable Willis and Henry Larkin approached from the opposite direction, their silhouettes visible beneath the churchyard larch trees. Willis looked frustrated. Henry looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of something heavier than mere suspicion. When they met in the center of the lane, Miss Marple touched Willis's arm before he could speak. "Constable," she said softly, "may I speak with Mr. Larkin alone for a moment?" Willis blinked in surprise but stepped back. The vicar joined him, leaving Miss Marple and Henry Larkin beneath the bare branches that trembled faintly in the evening breeze. Henry swallowed hard. "If this is about that glove, it is not," Miss Marple said kindly. "It is about the box your nephew saw you carrying." His breath hitched. "He told you." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle. "He is worried for you." Henry rubbed his forehead with trembling fingers. "I didn't mean for anyone to find out. I only wanted to make things right." Miss Marple let silence offer him refuge, and slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. "It wasn't a box taken from Mrs. Hartwell's house," he began. "It was something I'd kept at the post office, something that came through weeks ago, before all this started, addressed to Arthur Hartwell years after his death." Miss Marple raised her eyebrow slightly. "And you opened it?" Henry nodded, shame coloring his cheeks. "I shouldn't have. It was wrong. But the return address was smudged, and the handwriting, something about it seemed familiar. When I read the contents, I panicked." "What did it contain?" "A note," Henry whispered. "Not long. Just a few lines accusing Arthur Hartwell of betrayal, the same he's now being accused of in that anonymous letter, and with it a name. Someone I recognized. Someone who left the village years ago after a terrible quarrel." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with quiet intuition. "A quarrel with Arthur?" Henry nodded again, and I thought if the woman received such a message, she'd be devastated. Arthur was her whole world. I remembered how she nearly broke when he died. So I hid the letter. I meant to burn it, but I lost my nerve." Miss Marple folded her hands. "But someone else knew of it." "I think so," Henry whispered. "A tall man came into the post office a fortnight ago, asked whether any letters had arrived for Mrs. Hartwell recently. I told him no, but the way he looked at me, it was as though he already knew I was lying." Miss Marple breathed in the crisp night air. "So the stranger does exist." Henry nodded vigorously. "I saw him again last night. He must have followed me. That's why I panicked when I saw him near the churchyard. I thought if he's trying to frighten her, maybe he thinks she has something I hid." Miss Marple regarded him with deep compassion. "You are trying to shield her, but sometimes shielding creates the very shadows others exploit." Henry's voice cracked. "I know. I'm so sorry." "Did you tell anyone about the letter?" she asked. "No, but someone else must have known. The name on the paper, I think the sender wants a reaction. I want old wounds reopened." Miss Marple touched his sleeve gently. "And I believe Mrs. Hartwell may soon tell us why." Henry's expression changed from fear to dawning confusion, then to something like understanding. "Does she know something?" "Not deliberately," Miss Marple replied. "But grief confuses memory, and sometimes the truth lies not in what someone remembers clearly, but in what they avoid remembering." Before Henry could respond, a chill wind rustled the hedge behind them. Miss Marple turned her head in a subtle shift, not of alarm, but recognition. Someone stood at the far bend of the lane. A tall figure, half veiled in shadow, coat collar raised against the cold. Henry stiffened. "It's him!" Constable Willis stepped forward, calling out sharply, "Who's there?" The figure remained still for a heartbeat, a silhouette watching, measuring, then slipping silently back into the darkness, vanishing among the frost-silvered hedgerows. Willis sprinted after him, Henry following close behind. The vicar moved instinctively to support Miss Marple. Though she did not need it, her posture remained composed, as though the scene unfolding only confirmed her quiet suspicions. As the echoes of pursuit faded into the night, Miss Marple remained perfectly still. The hedge, The frost, the fading lantern light all seemed to hold their breath. She knew now what must be done. The next step was not to chase the stranger. The next step was to gather everyone into one room, to speak gently, to arrange the final piece of her psychological snare. Miss Marple turned calmly back toward the lane, her eyes reflecting a quiet certainty. She would call them together, and in that gathering, the truth, the whole of it, would finally take shape. Miss Marple's calm declaration lingered in the night air, its certainty cutting through the fading echoes of Constable Willis's pursuit. The frost-glittered lane lay still again, as though waiting for her next step. She tightened her scarf, turned toward the vicarage, and said with quiet firmness, "It is time to bring everyone together, Reverend." Within half an hour, the small sitting room of Mrs. Hartwell's cottage was filled. Mrs. Weatherby perched protectively beside Mrs. Hartwell, the vicar stood by the hearth, Constable Willis, breathless from the chase, leaned against the wall, and Henry Larkin, pale but resolute, sat stiffly in a corner. Even Tommy had returned, summoned by Miss Marple with a gentle but undeniable authority. Only one person was missing the stranger. But Miss Marple did not need him physically present. She cleared her throat softly, and the room fell into expectant stillness. "My dear friends," she began, "we have all been looking outward down lanes, behind hedges, into shadows for the cause of these disturbances. But shadows deceive. We must instead consider what has been, stirred up here, in this very cottage, and in the past it represents." Mrs. Hartwell clasped her hands tightly. "I don't understand. What is the past?" "The past your husband never spoke of," Miss Marple replied gently. "Or at least not to you." A tremor passed through the room. Henry Larkin closed his eyes. "Miss Marple, must we?" She nodded. "For the sake of truth and for the sake of peace." She stepped toward the small wooden box on the table. "This box has lingered in our thoughts all day, and rightly so, for it secured not money or valuables, but memories. Private papers your husband kept for reasons you did not know, Mrs. Hartwell." Mrs. Hartwell swallowed. "He was an honest man." "Honest," Miss Marple agreed softly, "but not always forthcoming. Many people, when faced with choosing between truth and appearing respectable, choose the latter even when honor would require confession instead." The vicar exhaled heavily, and Mrs. Weatherby sat forward, eyes wide. Miss Marple continued. "Years ago, shortly before he married you, Arthur Hartwell was involved in a serious dispute with a man whose name appeared on the anonymous letter Henry received." Tommy glanced nervously at his uncle. Henry cleared his throat. The quarrel wasn't public, but the man left the village soon after. People whispered, but no one knew the details. Except, Miss Marple added, Arthur Hartwell, who kept a record in that box. Her eyes softened. Not guilt, but fear. Perhaps he believed the matter might one day return. Mrs. Hartwell shook her head, confused. But why would someone accuse him now, after all these years? "Because the man from that quarrel returned," Miss Marple said gently. "The tall figure who has been haunting the lane is not a stranger at all. He is the son of the man with whom your husband quarreled. A son who found old letters among his father's effects after his recent death." A ripple of realization passed through the room. "He came seeking justice?" the vicar whispered. "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "He came seeking truth. But truth clouded by grief is easily mistaken for vengeance." She turned to Henry. "You hid the letter because you feared it would break Mrs. Hartwell's heart." Henry nodded miserably. "I thought it was cruel, unnecessary." "And the son," Miss Marple continued, "saw you take the envelope. He believed you were hiding evidence. So he attempted to frighten you both of you into revealing what you had concealed." Mrs. Hartwell gasped. "The frost, the photograph." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He wished to unsettle." "No harm. He needed confirmation that some fragment of his father's story was preserved. Willis frowned. But why the glove? And the message, "You were seen"? To pressure, Miss Marple replied. Not threatened. He hoped fear would make Henry reveal what he had taken. But fear muddles judgment. Henry grew frantic. Mrs. Hartwell became terrified, and the poor man thought his smallest gesture would shake loose the truth. Mrs. Hartwell looked helpless. But what was the truth? What did my husband do? Miss Marple approached her gently. My dear, nothing criminal, nothing shameful, only humans. Arthur Hartwell disagreed violently with his friend, accusing him of selfishness during a family crisis. Hard words, deep wounds, written in a moment of anger and kept out of stubborn pride. But the man left the village not because of Arthur, but because he feared his own failings had been exposed. Mrs. Hartwell's tears slipped silently. So my husband was not being accused, merely remembered. Precisely, Miss Marple said warmly. The son misunderstood his father's old bitterness, and you, my dear, were meant only to confirm whether your husband kept cruel evidence which the son feared. Mrs. Weatherby dabbed her eyes. Oh, the poor man, Henry Larkin spoke hoarsely. I should have told you, Mrs. Hartwell. I only wished to spare you. Mrs. Hartwell rose slowly. For the first time that day, her back straightened, her breath steadying. Miss Marple, where is this man now? In the hedgerow still, I expect, Miss Marple replied calmly, uncertain whether to approach or flee. Constable Willis straightened. Shall I fetch him? Yes, Miss Marple said, but gently. He is troubled, not dangerous. As Willis slipped outside, Miss Marple gave Mrs. Hartwell's hands a small, firm squeeze. The frost on the window, dear, was not a message to you, but a reflection of his grief. A man trying, clumsily, to grasp something long buried. Mrs. Hartwell exhaled shakily, and I let the shadows grow. We all do, Miss Marple murmured, but daylight clarifies. Moments later, Willis returned with a tall man at his side, hollow-eyed, thin and trembling with a mixture of defiance and shame. Mrs. Hartwell stared at him, not with fear, but with dawning compassion. My husband did not betray your father, she said gently. They hurt each other, but both regretted it. The man nodded, voice breaking. I thought there must be more. There rarely is, Miss Marple said softly. Only misunderstandings left too long in the cold. The frost on the window outside began to melt as the heat of the room rose, a symbolic thaw. An unspoken peace settled. Miss Marple stepped back, her work complete. The village, she knew, would return to its gentle rituals. Gossip would soften into sympathy. And Mrs. Hartwell, though shaken, would rest easier knowing that her home, once disturbed by shadows, was hers again. Later, as she walked back to her cottage beneath the quiet stars, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, a tender melancholy for the frailties of human nature. All lives, she whispered to the night, casting their little frost upon the window. It is our task only to see clearly what lies beneath.